Hi there, welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to be installing a set of these Yukon Gear Chromoly rear axle shafts for my 2012 JK. Let's check these bad boys out. Oh yeah!
There probably wasn't anything wrong with my stock axle shaft, but I wanted peace of mind out on the trails. So I'm going to install a set of Yukon Gear's Chromoly Axle-shafts. The 4030 Chromoly construction makes these shafts a ton more durable than stock, which is exactly what I'm looking for out on the trails. The kit includes everything you need to complete this install. Let's get into the teardown. The first thing you need to do is to drain the pumpkin. Then remove the brakes. And unbolt the bearing retainer. Depending on the age of your Jeep, this step can be a bit tough.
So what can happen when you're doing this job on an older Jeep like Ruby here, who's 11 years old, what can happen is you've got an inner dust shield. This dust shield has 4 studs attached. And because the nuts on the backside were quite corroded, I applied so much torque that it basically spun the stud inside the dust shield. So what I'm having to do is basically pinch the inside of the stud to continue getting the nut off. And to do so, I have to remove my parking brake assembly. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, one of the things you may want to do is before you start this process, the day before, night before, whatever, maybe just apply a little bit of liquid wrench on the other side just to loosen up those nuts so that you're not at risk of spinning the studs.
Back to the teardown. Next up, remove the ABS sensor. Again, I was planning on replacing my park brake shoes regardless, but if the bearing retainer studs spin, you may have to remove the shoes to gain access to the head of the stud. Vice grips for the win. Sometimes the axle shafts can be tough to extract. You can either use a slide hammer or this method, but mine didn't need much of a tug at all. Try your best to get the bearing race out by hand. If not, gently use a tool. Try not to damage the housing, as it can cause a slow leak if you do. Because I have a horrible case of OCD, I'm going to do a bunch of cleaning and painting. Now I'm ready to install my new park brake shoes. This is how the park brake assembly will look when they're installed. Pay close attention to the orientation of the primary spring hooks. Apply Anti-Sieze on all moving parts of the brake assembly. This is a crucial step, especially if you're going to be wheeling through water or snow. Since I never adjusted my adjuster assembly from new, I started out with the factory length. I connected the rod to the park brake line and fed it through the brand new rubber grommet. Again, make sure to add Anti-Sieze here. If you're doing this job solo, hang the upper shoe first and clip it into place. Once the upper shoe is installed, you can then attach the lever mechanism. Make sure the hook is facing upwards. Install the primary spring now. Again, notice the orientation of the hooks. For the lower shoe, if you are doing this alone, you may want some welder's clamps. I just used my wife to hold the shoe in place while I fastened the clip. A flat blade driver and needle nose pliers work the best. Next, I attached the adjuster spring. And then the second primary spring.
And now it's time to move on to the axle shafts. And given my recent history with axle shafts, Terraflex, I was just a little bit nervous, to say the least.
Unlike the Terraflex front axle shaft fiasco, these Yukon shafts were the perfect length. That being said, driver and passenger are different lengths, so be sure to put the shorter shaft on the driver's side and the longer shaft on the passenger side. As I mentioned earlier, these come with all the hardware you need, including 10.9 studs. However, you will have to press them in, as well as the bearing assembly, and since I don't own a press, I took them to a local shop to have this done. Now it's time to slide the new axle shafts in. This is very straightforward. But be sure to apply just a bit of downward pressure while pushing and twisting to get the splines of the shaft to line up with those of the diff. Now torque down the 4 bolts on the back side of the bearing retainer. I couldn't find any torque specs for this, so I just went to 100 pounds. Now it's time to adjust the park brake. Again, I went with the factory default length, so it should be close given that I never adjusted it since new. You want just a bit of friction here, and with the new shoes you'll be able to see the contact patch. These appear to have a pretty good pattern. I tested the park brake to make sure it grabbed. I had to use a lot of force to turn the axle. The brake assembly was also quite snug laterally, so the shoes seem to have a good engagement. If you are replacing your grommets, be sure you don't forget about the park brake adjuster window plug. Also, it's a good idea to clean up your ABS sensor before reinstalling it. Using your 8mm socket, tighten it down gently. Hand tight is fine here. And finally, reattach the connector.
Now, this is actually a pretty easy install. You can hammer this one out in about 2 hours. Less if you're just doing the axle shafts. And again, you know, it can be done with one person, but you know, it's really hard to get the shoes in place by yourself. It might be a little easier leaving the axle shafts in place so that the shoes have something to kind of rest against. But you know, either invest in some welder's pliers or a clamp of some kind, or just ask your buddy, your wife, your kids, whatever, just to hold the shoe in place while you clip the lower one in. So as with all my upgrades, the first thing I do is a test drive. But to be honest, I don't really know what there is to test drive with rear axles. What else is there to say? The axles stayed on. I didn't hear an immense grinding sound the first time I jammed on it, so I think we're good. The irony in all of this is I'm actually planning on replacing my entire axle assembly with the Dynatrac Dana 44, Dana 60 package. So in about, you know, next January, February, March sometime, next spring sometime, you're gonna see a pretty kick-ass set of Dana 44s from a Rubicon listed on Kijiji. But one thing I can test is the e-brake, and I'm going to do that right now. It seems to be grabbing fairly well. I could probably go for a little bit of an adjustment right at the handle because I do have to pull it quite a ways. But you know, it does stop. So I guess that's a successful change of the e-brake shoes. I hope you liked this video. If you did, smash that like button, click the like button, just do some with the like button. Don't forget to subscribe and leave me a comment or two. Let me know how I'm doing. In the meantime, I'm out of here.